On the night of October 8, 2009, the Jameson family left their small home in Eufaula, Oklahoma, heading into the San Boys Mountains to scout a remote plot of land. Bobby Jameson drove their white pickup. His wife Sherilyn sat beside him, and Madison, their 6-year-old daughter, clutched a teddy bear quietly in the back seat. That was the last time anyone in town saw them alive. The next morning, the family's pickup was found abandoned on a dirt trail deep in the woods. The engine was cold. The doors were unlocked. Inside were all of their belongings, cell phones, wallets, nearly $32,000 in cash, an unfinished meal, and the GPS still running. But the family was nowhere to be found. One thing, however, made the deputies stop in their tracks. A photo of Madison on the phone, her face frozen in an unspoken terror, staring directly into the lens as if pleading for help. The case quickly became national news. The Jameson family mystery, they called it. Theories ran wild: drugs, cults, even a suicide pact. But no one really knew what happened that night in the mountains. The file grew cold, gathering dust on a back shelf. 15 years later, I, Samantha Price, reopened that file. I didn't expect to find much. But then, tucked inside a forgotten drawer at the Latimer County Records Office, I found a cassette tape no one had ever logged. On that tape, Madison whispers, "He is here." And then another voice, lower, warped, speaking words I can never unhear. "They listen better. In the dark." From that moment on, I knew I had opened a door I could never close. A door into the dark, where the Jamesons didn't just disappear. They were hunted. I came back to Eufaula on a rainy autumn afternoon, the road into town shimmering like an old clouded mirror. This little city had never really woken up after the Jameson family disappeared. 15 years had passed, but whenever their name came up, people still lowered their voices, lowered their eyes, as if the ghosts of Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison were still hovering somewhere, listening to every word. I stopped the car in front of the Latimer County Records Office. The old brick building leaned a little, moss creeping up its walls, the sign over the door hanging crooked, the hallway lights buzzing faintly. The man at the door looked at me with dry, indifferent eyes. The kind of man who'd seen 100 nosy strangers come and go, finding nothing. I just nodded and told myself, this time would be different. Inside, the air was cold enough to bite. The smell of damp paper and mildew hung heavy as I walked between rows of steel cabinets stacked with old case files. Names of the dead, the missing, the forgotten. I followed the faded label on the shelf, Case 091009, and pulled out a thick file sealed in yellowing plastic. The photos of the scene were all there. The pickup abandoned on a narrow trail in the woods, all 4 doors flung open. Inside, cash, cell phones, uneaten bread, Madison's teddy bear on the backseat floor. And then, the photo that froze me in place. Madison staring straight into the camera. Her round eyes wide, her little mouth half open, as if she were pleading for help. I shut the file with a shiver. I was about to leave when my eyes caught a small drawer at the very bottom of the cabinet. Its lock was rusted through. Something told me to crouch down, tug hard. The metal screeched as it gave way. Inside was only a small evidence bag, cloudy plastic, and one cassette tape. Layers of peeling tape wrapped around it, and on the label, scrawled in shaky handwriting, Jameson, Night. My fingers were cold now. My pulse hammered, though I wasn't sure if it was fear or hope. Back at my motel that night, I slotted the tape into an old recorder, took a deep breath, and hit play. The hiss was sharp at first, then it settled into silence. And then, a little girl's voice, trembling, broken. "He is here." A long pause. Then another voice, not a child's. Low, hoarse, warped like it came from someplace it shouldn't. "They listen better. In the dark." I stood there, frozen. The tape stopped, but those words didn't leave the room. They hung in the air like smoke, clinging to my skin, sinking into my bones. In that moment I knew. This wasn't just a disappearance. This was a hunt that someone had planned. And I'd just stepped into it. Tomorrow I would drive up to the Sandboys Mountains, to the place where the truck was left, to the place where they vanished. And I would find out. The next morning, I drove out of town before the sun had even crested the mountains. The road into the Sandboys felt like a crack splitting the forest in two. Trees thick on either side, the wind cutting sharp and cold. Morning mist clung to the windshield, and for a moment I felt like I was driving into a place that didn't really belong to anyone. I stopped where police had found the Jameson truck all those years ago. Even after 15 years, the clearing looked exactly like it did in the case file photos. Lonely and bare, grass leaning this way and that, a few loose stones scattered near the edge. I got out, staring at the ground, trying to imagine what it must have looked like that day. In my mind, I could still see it. The white pickup, all 4 doors hanging open. Cash spilled across the seats. Madison's teddy bear on the floor. Her wide, round eyes staring at something no one else could see. I pulled out my phone and replayed the tape I'd found the night before. Madison's whisper, "He is here." And then, that warped, awful voice. They listen better. In the dark. The wind hissed through the treetops above me. I shivered. That's when something caught my eye. Just beyond where I stood, a flash of gray glinted low in the grass. A strip of duct tape, half peeled from the base of a tree. I crouched, pulled it free. Beneath it, wrapped in cloudy plastic, was something hard and flat. I opened it and froze. It was an old Polaroid, faded and creased. Madison stood there in her little coat, right here in this clearing. But behind her was a figure. A man, tall, thin, standing just beyond the truck, his face lost in shadow. Only his hand was visible, long bony fingers hanging at his side. Wrong somehow. I flipped the photo over. On the back, in shaky pencil, someone had written, "The Guest." My breath came faster. This photo had never appeared in any file I'd seen. I slid it back into the evidence bag, took a GPS snapshot of the spot, and returned to my car. On my way back to town, I stopped at the county sheriff's office. I wanted to see the original incident report from that night. But as soon as I flashed my press badge, the woman at the front desk shook her head. "Jameson file?" she said. "Sealed? Only the captain can approve access." I forced a polite smile, thanked her, and turned to leave. But just as I reached the door, I heard her murmur to a colleague, "Another one of the curious. Just like that Langley guy." I stopped cold. Langley. That name hadn't appeared in anything I read last night. But I knew, instinctively, that name was where I needed to start. Back at the motel, the light outside already faded to a dull amber. I spread the case materials out on the bed. Madison's photo, the cassette, the new Polaroid. And on the first page of my notebook, I wrote a new name and circled it 3 times. Howard Langley. Tomorrow I'd find him. And this time, I wasn't coming back empty-handed. The next morning, I stopped by City Hall to pull the old Eufaula residential records. Howard Langley's name had haunted me all night, like a faint thread leading straight into the dark. The records clerk was an old man with a dry cough who didn't ask many questions. I told him I was working on a podcast about the Jameson case. He just looked at me, then slowly paged through a cracked ledger with trembling fingers. And then he stopped, his bony finger resting on one line, Howard E. Langley. Lived on the far north edge of town, County Road 22. The last house before the road dead ends into the woods. The note beside it simply read, "Vacant." "Where'd he go?" I asked. The old man shrugged. "No one knows. Disappeared in 2010, right after the Jamesons. House has been empty since." I thanked him, jotted down the address. As I turned to leave, he added something, voice gruff, but just a little shaky. "Be careful. Folks say he heard things no one else could, and recorded them." Langley's house stood alone at the end of a dirt road, hidden behind a row of overgrown pines, a sagging iron gate, and a tilted, "No trespassing" sign. I parked outside, stood on the muddy path littered with dead leaves. and took a long breath. The gate groaned like it was alive when I pushed it open. The front yard was a tangle of weeds, broken children's toys half buried in the mud. The front door wasn't locked. I stepped inside and was hit by the smell. Mold, burnt wiring, dust thick as ash. The house was dark, as if no light had touched it in years. A faint, pale glow came through the dirty windows, just enough to see peeling paint on the walls, black cables snaking down from the ceiling, across the floor, into the vents like coiled serpents. On a table sat a mess of cassette recorders, microphones, old radios, tangled wires. One of the recorders still blinked, a tiny red LED, as if it had never stopped. I raised my own recorder and hit record. The air felt heavy, silent enough I could hear my heart. I moved through the ruined kitchen, down a narrow hall. And then, I heard it. A click, not from my device. It came from somewhere under the floorboards. The sound of a cassette rewinding. I crouched, pressed my ear to the cold wood. And then a whisper drifted up, distant, warped, like it came from somewhere it shouldn't. They listen better. In the dark. I jerked back, my pulse pounding. In the corner of the hall was a narrow door, half blocked by a nailed plank. On the plank, someone had carved a single word. Basement. I pulled out my flashlight, my hand shaking but steady enough. I pried the plank away, dust swirling in the beam of light, revealing a rusty iron handle. I turned it. It groaned. The basement door opened slowly, and a rush of cold air hit me, carrying the smell of rust, damp wood, and something sweet, metallic. Wrong. I stood at the top of the stairs, staring into the black below, and whispered to myself, Howard. Where did you hide them? And then I began to descend. The basement steps creaked under my feet, the wood soft and rotting with age. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing stained brick walls and a ceiling so low I almost had to duck. The air was thick, icy, and heavy with that metallic, damp smell. The kind of smell you only find in places that have held too many secrets. I moved slowly, one step at a time, listening. Every footfall seemed to echo into some deeper, darker hollow beneath me. And then, I heard it. A faint hiss, like a cassette slowing to a crawl. A steady rhythmic clicking sound of tape turning. I swept the beam of light left. There it was. A metal table shoved against the wall, dust caked thick on every surface except for the tape recorder at its center. Still running. The little red LED blinked. Wires snaked down to the floor, disappearing into the wall. I crouched, staring at it, my hand trembling as I pressed stop. The tape fell silent. But the room didn't feel quiet. Not really. I shone my light across the rest of the basement, and froze. In the far corner stood an old industrial freezer, its surface rusted, the handle faintly etched with greasy fingerprints, as if it had been opened and shut, over and over. Next to it, shelves stacked with neatly labeled cassette tapes. Dozens of them, all with carefully written tags. Bobby, last breath. Sherilyn, crying. Madison, laughing. I backed up, gripping my flashlight tight enough to make my knuckles ache. Those labels, they felt like headstones. And then my eyes locked on the freezer. I swallowed hard, stepped closer. My fingers shook as I grabbed the handle, and pulled. The door groaned open. At once the smell hit me, sickly sweet, chemical, freezing cold. I gagged, coughing into my sleeve, but I forced myself to look. Inside were 3 shapes, wrapped in thick plastic sheeting, sealed tight, laid side by side. Each with a name scrawled in black marker, Bobby. Sherilyn, Madison. I didn't scream. I just stood there, numb, listening to my own pulse hammer in my ears. This was where he hid them. I staggered back, doubling over, trying to keep from throwing up. Behind me, a sharp click cut through the silence. I spun around. The tape on the table had started itself again. That warped, guttural voice filled the air. They listened better. In the dark. I lunged forward, ripped the tape out of the machine, clutching it in my hand like I could crush it into silence. The room fell quiet again, But my lungs still burned, my breath coming hard. As I turned to leave, my flashlight caught something high on the wall. Ventilation slits, black cables crisscrossing, and a scrap of yellowed paper taped to the ceiling. On it, written in a jagged, uneven hand, "They're here to listen. Not to let go," I bolted. I ran up those stairs like they would never end. Outside, back in the fading daylight, I didn't dare look back. But I swear, I could still hear it, faint and low, whispering behind me with every step. Howard Langley hadn't just killed them. He kept their voices, and he hadn't stopped. I sat in the car for over an hour, frozen, still gripping the tape so tightly the label stuck to my palm. Outside, the moon was up now, its cold silver light cutting through the pines, casting long black streaks across the windshield, just like the cables I'd seen in Langley's basement. Every time the wind hissed through the trees, I flinched, afraid I'd hear a whisper slip through the cracks. Eventually, I started the engine and drove, as though I could outrun whatever was following me. The whole way back, I left the radio off. I didn't want to hear another sound. The motel room felt smaller and colder than it had the night before. I locked the door, pulled the curtains tight, dragged the table to the center of the room, and spread everything out. The file, Madison's photo, the Polaroid with the shadow, her original tape, and the new one from the basement. I sat down, took a deep breath, and loaded the new tape into my recorder. The hiss tore through the silence, and then Madison's voice came, weaker this time, trembling, almost a sob. "I promise. I'll be quiet if he stops looking at me." A few seconds of dead air. And then that man's voice again. Lower, slower, crawling across the room like it had weight. "Quiet. Listen, we're recording." I jumped back from the table, heart hammering, breath shallow. I stopped the tape, but the sound, or the sense of it, still hung in the air, faint and heavy. Then I noticed something else. My own recorder, the one I'd brought still on the table, its little red light, was blinking. I hadn't hit record. I pulled the batteries. The light kept blinking. I froze, then grabbed my phone and searched Langley's name in the town records again. I found something I hadn't seen before. Before he vanished in 2010, Langley had been picked up by police twice, the last time just weeks after the Jamesons disappeared. The complaint? A neighbor reported him standing outside their house for hours, ear pressed to the wall, murmuring, "Record it. Write it down. For me." I jotted down the neighbor's address. The next morning I drove out there. A small house on the edge of town. Ellis, 70-something. Bent-backed, eyes sunken. When I showed him Langley's photo, he flinched like I'd hit him. "I already told the cops. He's gone. He's not coming back. You shouldn't go looking." I pressed gently. "Mr. Ellis, you heard him say something outside your house that night, didn't you?" He was quiet for a long time before finally whispering. He said, "The kids' voices, in the walls. Beautiful. And they needed to be kept before they stopped." I left his house with my head spinning. That night, back in the motel, I opened the file and the Polaroid again. I zoomed in on the man's hand behind Madison. It was longer than it should have been. And on the back of that hand, a deep circular scar. Langley, he had been there, that very day. I picked up my pen and wrote a single line in my notebook. He didn't just hear them. He kept them. And right then, the desk lamp flickered. A click echoed in the quiet room. And I understood. Even after 15 years, the game wasn't over. I didn't sleep that night. In the motel room, the weak yellow light pooled across the table, where the recorder still sat, its red light blinking in that same steady rhythm. I'd pulled the batteries, stripped the wires, but it wouldn't stop, blinking every 7 seconds. Patient, persistent, as if it had already chosen its prey. I sat there and stared at it, waiting or maybe just enduring. And then, in the thick silence, I heard it. A voice. It wasn't coming from the speaker exactly, nor just inside my head. It was somewhere in between, slow and distorted, metallic. Just 3 words, cold as iron. Keep recording. I jolted upright, sending the recorder crashing to the floor, its plastic casing shattering, copper guts spilling out. But the little red light kept blinking. I couldn't stand it anymore. I ran, stuffed the pieces into my trunk, got behind the wheel, and drove into the night. I didn't know where I was going, just that I couldn't stay there another second. The road through the woods was colder than I remembered. The moon hanging high above, silver light threading through the trees, bending the darkness into long black ribbons beneath my tires. But the dark didn't let me go. The dashboard lights flickered, and a tiny red LED began blinking. 7 seconds, then another light, then another. Like the whole car was infected by the same signal, slowly becoming just another recording device. I pulled over, forehead resting on the steering wheel, my breath thick and hot in my lungs. That was when it hit me, something horrible and final. I wasn't the hunter anymore. I was the hunted. I was being heard. I was being recorded. And I was being led. When I finally raised my head, the decision was already made. I turned the car around and drove back to Langley's house. The rusted gate waited for me like the mouth of a cave. I pushed it open, the wind cutting through me in sharp gusts, dust rising in little clouds around my boots. I descended into the basement again, each step heavier than the last. The familiar damp smell wrapped around me as I reached the bottom. But this time, it was quiet. No hiss, no whispers, just silence. And the overwhelming sense that everything down here was watching. I ran my fingers along the shelves of tapes, dozens of them neatly stacked. I stopped at one, Madison, laughing. On the back, under a thin film of dust, was something I hadn't noticed before. Scrawled in shaky letters, "Next, her." My chest tightened. I swept my flashlight across the room, slowly, until it landed on one corner of the wall where the cement looked different. Smoother, newer. I fetched a crowbar from the car and went to work, swinging hard. Dust choked the air. Brick crumbled under my hands. Behind the wall was a small hollow, barely 2 meters deep. Inside, a narrow iron bed frame. Restraints dangling from its corners. A microphone clamped to the headboard, its cable vanishing into the wall. And on the mattress, propped neatly, a wooden placard painted red. Host, Samantha. I froze. The bed had been prepared. Not for them, for me. Above me, in the highest vent, a tiny red dot flickered once, then went dark. But I could still hear it. That click, steady, waiting. I left the basement with my breath coming hard, each step heavy, as though the darkness itself clung to my skin and followed me out. The rusted gate of Langley's house groaned shut behind me, its sound swallowed by the night. I drove back to town in silence, but it no longer felt like I was in control. Everything. The streetlights, the wind hissing through the window seals, the little red light blinking on the dashboard, seemed to be guiding me forward, insisting I keep going, forbidding me to stop. When I returned to the motel, something about the room felt different. Not ransacked, not obviously disturbed. But something had slipped into the corners, left invisible marks. The recorder I thought I'd smashed now sat perfectly intact on the table, its red light blinking lazily, as if it had never been touched. On my laptop, the audio files I'd saved the night before were gone. In their place was a single file named final.wav. I opened it, a long hiss. Then a child's voice, trembling, weak but unmistakable. "You are next." My heartbeat roared in my ears, filling the room. I slammed the laptop shut, kicked the recorder off the table, but the sound lingered, curling out of the walls, the doorframe, my own head. On the desk, among the scattered papers, lay a sheet I was certain hadn't been there before. A list of names, each one crossed out. Bobby, Sherilyn, Madison, and at the very bottom, freshly written, the ink still dark, Samantha Price. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat in the dark, staring at that red light as it blinked. 7 seconds, then 7 more. Steady, patient, like the heartbeat of a predator waiting in the dark. Around 3 a.m., I stood up and walked out. I drove toward the old cemetery, where they'd found the Jameson family's remains the year before, though no cause of death was ever determined. The grounds were empty, silent, just rows of crooked headstones leaning into a thick fog. I walked the narrow path, each step heavier, as if I were stepping on buried cables, one after another. When I stopped at Madison's grave, the beam of my flashlight flickered, then died. The dark swallowed everything. And then, deep in the fog, a tiny red light appeared, blinking 7 seconds, then 7 more. It was in that moment I understood. I wasn't just telling this story anymore. I had become part of his story. And now, I was being recorded too. The next morning, I woke up in the middle of a mess of papers, though I couldn't remember when I'd finally drifted off. The pale light outside the window didn't make the room feel any brighter. It was the same gray haze as before, clinging to my skin like ash. The recorder was still there, sitting neatly on the table. I could have sworn I'd knocked it to the floor last night, yet here it was, unscathed, its little red light blinking lazily, patiently, like it had all the time in the world. On my laptop, the file final.wav had already renamed itself, observercomplete.wav. I didn't open it. I didn't need to hear any more to know I wasn't outside the story anymore. I packed my things in silence, stuffing everything into my bag, rolling up the file as tight as I could. But just as I reached the door, I saw a slip of paper pushed under it. One line scrawled in a shaky hand. "He's finished with them. Now it's your turn." I folded the paper, tucked it into my pocket, and stepped out. I didn't know where I was driving. The road stretched ahead like it had no end. Each curve, each sign, each row of trees eerily familiar, like I was trapped in a loop, driving through the same stretch of tape over and over. And then, my car rolled to a stop outside Langley's abandoned house. I couldn't remember deciding to come back. This time the gate wasn't rusted. It gleamed, freshly painted, smooth under my hand as I pushed it open. I stepped inside and saw a faint glow spilling up from the basement. Not flashlight glow. Red light, steady. 7 seconds, then 7 more, like the heartbeat of something artificial. I walked slowly down the basement stairs, each creak of the wood sounding louder than the last, as if the house itself was holding me here. Everything below had changed. The shelves of dusty tapes were gone. In their place stood a long, black-draped table, lined with microphones and mounted cameras, all aimed squarely at the narrow iron bed in the corner. On the mattress, the wooden placard was gone. In its place was a single sheet of white paper, slanted handwriting across it. "Host, ready." Around the room, all the little red lights flared to life at once. 7 seconds, then 7 more. I stood there, frozen, sweat running cold down my spine, my legs refusing to move. I didn't know where Langley had gone, but I knew he was still here. In the tapes, in the walls, in the sound of my own breath, being recorded, second by second. I turned toward the stairs just in time to see the basement door slam shut. The red lights kept blinking, all of them now fixed on me. And I understood. This wasn't Bobby's story anymore, or Sherilyn's, or Madison's. This was mine. And he was about to press record. I stood frozen in the basement, the red light pulsing every 7 seconds, sweeping across my face, cold and indifferent. The 4 walls seemed to have closed in, silent, tight, and more alive than ever. I could hear nothing but my own breath, though even that now sounded recorded, replicated into something distorted, alien. On the table, the tiny microphones all pointed at me, each one lit, blinking as if waiting for a command from someone no longer physically here. I stepped slowly toward the iron bed, my eyes falling on the scrap of white paper. Host. Ready. And I understood now. This wasn't a relic. This was a stage. He'd been waiting for me. Since the moment I touched the first tape. Since the moment I heard Madison's whisper. Since the moment I decided to tell their story. I looked down at the microphone on the mattress, its cord snaking deep into the wall, leading somewhere I'd never see. The basement was just one node of a larger network, something deeper, more intricate, running under the town, rooting itself into other stories that no one had told yet. I placed my hand on the microphone. A chill shot straight down my spine. The red lights brightened in unison. And then, I heard him. Not from the speaker, not from the walls, but from inside my head. Begin. I didn't open my mouth, but still my voice rose somewhere, repeating itself like a looped tape. My name is Samantha Price. I am ready. Sound poured through the room. Laughter, sobs, shallow breathing. A chorus of voices layered on top of each other. Bobby's, Sherilyn's, Madison's. And then mine, warped and fragile, tangled in their sick harmony. We're still here. The red lights blinked faster. The microphones all swiveled toward me. The cameras flickered green, coming to life, recording. I didn't run. I just stood there, feeling the cold current ripple through me and the unseen eyes boring into me, knowing that every fear, every heartbeat, every thought I had was being kept. Forever. When the room finally dimmed, leaving nothing but the faint shimmer of red light, I realized one last thing. This wasn't my story anymore. It was his. And then came the click. The tape began to roll, and everything went black.